This video is brought to you by Brilliant. On Wednesday, the Green Party released their manifesto. Manifesto week is usually good for the Greens because they get to talk about a whole load of eye-catching and popular policies. But it's especially important this year because the Greens are currently struggling in the polls. Despite Labour's tack to the centre, which should in theory benefit them, polls suggest that they're now the fifth most popular party in the UK, well behind the Lib Dems and Reform. So in this video, we're going to take a look at the Green Party's manifesto, how it compares to the other parties, and whether or not it'll improve their electoral fortunes. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. Let's start with the Greens' workers' policies, because they're pretty fun. The Greens want to push for a 4-day week, introduce a 10-to-1 pay ratio for all private and public companies, which basically means no one in the company can be paid more than 10 times that of anyone else, and raise the minimum wage to £15 an hour, no matter your age. Similarly, the Greens have some pretty generous public service spending plans. They want to increase NHS spending by nearly 15% by 2030 and give junior doctors a 35% pay increase. The Greens also want to scrap tuition fees and massively increase education spending, including a massive teacher pay uplift to fix what they describe as the teacher recruitment crisis. The Greens want to spend another £2.5 billion to fix both the UK's judicial and prison systems, reduce sentences for low-level offences, and decriminalise personal possession of drugs while pursuing, quote, evidence-based drug laws. They also want to spend £50 billion over the next 5 years insulating Britain's housing stock and massively invest in social housing to build 150,000 social houses each year, which they see as the best solution to the UK's housing crisis. The Greens also want to bring a variety of industry back into public ownership, including the train companies, water companies, and what they describe as the Big Five energy companies. To their credit, the Greens have been calling for this for ages, but it's become an increasingly mainstream idea in the past few years, especially after the energy and sewage crises, and polling suggests that there's now majority support for this policy. To make the green transition, the Greens want to invest massively in solar, wind, geothermal and hydropower energy projects via a vaccine-style task force approach to clean power, while ditching fossil fuels and nuclear power. The Greens also want to implement a so-called carbon tax, although there's been some confusion at the precise rate, because the original rate briefed to journalists actually implied a cut to fuel duty, so the manifesto itself doesn't have any specific details. The Greens hope that these measures will allow the UK to reach net zero by 2040, which is 10 years earlier than the current target of 2050 that Labour have also signed up to, and 5 years earlier than the Lib Dem target of 2045. The Greens also have an interesting bit in their manifesto about climate diplomacy. In short, they want to spend 1.5% of GNI on climate finance by 2033, which basically means lending lots of money to developing countries to help them make the green transition. This probably wouldn't be a popular policy, but the Greens argue it would be both a more efficient way of reducing CO2 emissions globally and good for the UK's soft power. Interestingly, Tony Blair recommended something similar last year, when Labour and the Tories were arguing over net zero, saying that the UK couldn't solve global warming alone and it would be better off spending money financing green projects in the developing world rather than imposing massive burdens on its domestic population. Now, obviously, taxation is a big issue for the Greens, given both their focus on economic inequality and the fact that they've got a lot of generous and potentially costly policies in the manifesto. In their manifesto, they claim that they could increase tax revenues by over £150 billion a year, by basically doing two things. First, they want to introduce a new tax on rich people's assets. Essentially, anyone owning assets over £10 million would have to pay 1% of all their assets' value each year, and this would rise to 2% for anyone with over £1 billion worth of assets. The Greens claim this would raise about £15 billion a year in tax. Second, they want to raise taxes for anyone earning over £50,000, with especially steep rises for higher earners. This marks them apart from the Labour Party, which have ruled out raising income tax or national insurance. The Greens also want to ditch the self-imposed fiscal rules that both Labour and the Conservatives have signed up to, and borrow more money to fund the climate transition. According to their manifesto, the limiting factor on borrowing isn't the interest rate on debt, but rather when too much borrowing creates inflation. To fix what they describe as an out-of-date and badly broken political system, the Greens want to replace the House of Lords with an elected second chamber, introduce votes for 16-year-olds, and end the new voter ID laws, replace first-past-the-post with proportional representation, and enforce stricter funding laws to reduce the influence of large donors on British politics. The Greens also want to expand devolution settlement, delegating more powers to Scotland and Wales, allowing both Holyrood and the Senedd the option to hold new independence referendums. Let's move to defence, which has sort of been the policy area where the Greens have received the most media attention, largely thanks to their policy on nuclear weapons. The Greens want to get rid of Trident, the UK's nuclear deterrent. The Greens want to continue support for Ukraine and stay in NATO, having reversed their long-standing opposition to NATO in 2023. When it comes to Gaza, the Greens would end military cooperation with Israel, reinstate funding for a UN agency for Palestinian refugees, and push for a sustainable ceasefire. When it comes to Europe, the Greens say they want to rejoin the EU as soon as the domestic political situation is favourable, tacitly accepting that it wouldn't be the most popular policy right now, but before that point they say that they'd try to rejoin the customs union and restore freedom of movement, especially for students. This makes them the most pro-EU party in the UK, given that the Lib Dems are now only committed to rejoining the single market. So, will this help the Greens' electoral fortunes? Well, obviously no one knows, but one of the issues for the Greens is that, while they've differentiated themselves from Labour, the Lib Dems, who used to be ideologically in between the Tories and Labour, have now moved to the left of Labour in lots of ways. This leaves less space for the Greens, and the Lib Dems have so far proved more adept campaigners, at least at the national level. Now, understanding exactly what has or is going to happen here can be a little tricky, requiring you to evaluate lots of information from different, often partial sources. It would be sensible then to begin improving your critical thinking skills so that you can keep sharp and better understand what's going on. And well, our sponsor Brilliant.org can help you do just that. Brilliant is the online learning platform that's designed specifically to teach you everything from maths, data analysis, programming, and AI from the ground up. You don't need a fancy degree or to have dedicated hundreds of hours to studying any of these. All you need is a device with an internet connection and a few spare minutes a day. And with your spare few minutes, you'll learn by actually doing, with Brilliant providing hands-on lessons that let you play around with concepts, a method that has been shown to be 6 times more effective than just watching lectures. What makes this even better is that this content is created by an award-winning team of teachers, researchers, and professionals from MIT, Caltech, Duke, Microsoft, and more. You can try everything Brilliant has to offer for free for a full 30 days. Just click on the link in the description. That way you'll also get 20% off an annual premium subscription.